that we understand a little bit of equilibrium and causes that can cause equilibrium, the net of all forces being zero, the net of algebraic sum of all moments about any point being zero, it is important also to understand if there are categories of equilibrium. In fact, there indeed are three categories of equilibrium. Let's explore the three categories of equilibrium with the help of a very simple example. So we have a cone resting on its base BC, its weight acting through its center of gravity downwards, and reaction from the ground upwards. Now, for equilibrium, obviously, R must be equal to W. R balances W. Not only that, the moment of R about G must be 0. That means R and W must be aligned with each other so that the line of action of R passes through G. It produces no moment about G. So it will produce no turning effect, right? So that's equilibrium. So this is equilibrium in the state. Now, I tilt this in this sense by a small angle theta. I tilt this with a small angle theta. Now, W weight continues to act through the center of gravity like this, and the reaction from the ground now passes through the point C, Very clearly, R produces no moment about C, but W produces a restoring moment. I have tilted it in the clockwise sense, and W will produce an anti-clockwise moment about C. W will produce an anti-clockwise moment about C, thus countering the clockwise turn, and it would get restored. It will get restored. So this is stable equilibrium. When you slightly displace it from its position of equilibrium, position of stable equilibrium, it will come back to its original state, because in this case W provides a restoring moment about C in this sense, and it will get back to the state. So this is stable equilibrium. One thing that you see is that the line of action of the weight, when I tilt it, the line of action of the weight still passes through the base BC. The line of action of the weight still passes through the base BC in stable equilibrium. Do you see that? That's one observation. So one, the line of action of W, in this case, W, which is the line of action of W, passes through the base. That's one. The other observation is, when I lift it this way, when I tilt it like this, what happens to the center of gravity? The center of gravity gets raised. And if the center of gravity gets raised, the potential energy increases. And bodies don't like to stay in states of higher potential energy, because when I raise it like this, G gets raised. G gets lifted from this position to this position. It gets raised above the ground further. And therefore, it has a propensity to get back to its original state. So two things that you must realize: what happens in stable equilibrium when I tilt it slightly, and if W still passes through the base BC on which it was resting, then it's a case of stable equilibrium, because this W will cause a restoration back to this original state. That's one thing. The second thing is, when I tilt it, the center of gravity gets raised. Higher potential energy, it doesn't want to be that way. So then it comes back to its lowest potential energy state. In fact, a state of stable equilibrium is a position of least potential energy. A state of stable equilibrium is a position of least potential energy. A state of stable equilibrium is a position of least potential energy of the system. And bodies would want to be in states of lowest potential energy, right? Now, so that's as far as stable equilibrium is concerned. Look at this. A cone resting at its vertex A. Look at its vertex, which is A. A cone resting at its vertex A, precariously resting. And what happens is that this W is vertical, passes its line of action, passes to the center of gravity. The reaction at A passes vertically upwards, and they are aligned. R and W are aligned so that the moment of R about G is 0 and there would be no turning effect. So for sure this is equilibrium. R becomes R is W for sure, and the moment of R about G is 0. Consequently, there is no turning effect. But when you slightly tilt it in this position, see BC from being horizontal, now it's slightly tilted. When it's slightly tilted, what happens is R will still pass through A. The weight will pass through this. What would happen is the weight will turn it further in this sense, because this weight produces about point A a clockwise effect. So if you have rotated it clockwise, this weight adds to further to the misery. It would want to rotate it clockwise further. It would want to rotate it clockwise further. So this weight has no intentions of restoring this body back to the state. It will get further and further and further displaced. It will get further and further and further displaced. Slight displacement that you have caused to the cone will cause it to get displaced further and further and further. And this kind of equilibrium, this is equilibrium, but it's a state of unstable equilibrium. And an unstable equilibrium is one where the center of gravity is at the highest position. Potential energy is very high, is the largest it could be. Maximum potential energy, it's in a state of maximum potential energy. And if it's in a state of maximum potential energy and you are giving it an opportunity to occupy lower and lower levels, lower and lower potential energy states, why would it not take it? It would take it with both hands, right? It would grab the opportunity and it will then tilt further and further and further and further and get the point G to the lowest height it could. Right? So that's as far as unstable equilibrium is concerned. It's equilibrium, but disturb it slightly from its equilibrium state, it'll get further and further displaced, right? And obviously, like I said, an unstable equilibrium is a state of equilibrium where potential energy is the greatest it could be. Then there is a third kind of equilibrium, which is neutral equilibrium. Look at this cone resting on its slant height, right? Resting on its generator, right? W passes through G, R goes upwards, passes through G, R balances W, right? Now, if you roll the cone further, if you roll it further on the ground, do you realize neither the line of action of G will change nor the line of action of R will change. And whatever new state you put it in by rolling it further on the ground, it will stay in that state. That means it's state agnostic. It's state neutral. Rolling it further on the ground will change nothing about the line of action of G or the reaction. They will still remain aligned. And if you give it a new state by rolling it further on the ground, it will stay in that state. And that state of equilibrium is neutral equilibrium, right? So again, when I talk of equilibrium, there are three kinds of equilibrium: stable equilibrium, unstable equilibrium, and neutral equilibrium. Unstable equilibrium is one where center of gravity is already occupying a lowest height so that the potential energy is least, and if you're trying to tilt it further, it would be averse to the tilt. It would want to get restored to its original state. Unstable equilibrium, the center of gravity has the highest height it could be, greatest potential energy, and therefore a small amount of tilt will add further and further to the misery. So center of gravity gets an opportunity to come to lower and lower potential energy states, and it will get further and further displaced. So equilibrium, but unstable equilibrium. And then this cone resting on its slant face is neutral equilibrium. G and R will remain aligned all the time. No matter how you roll it on the ground, it will always remain aligned, and that's neutral equilibrium. But let me get back to stable equilibrium. Look, when I tilted it further, when I tilted it from this state to this state, the line of action of W was lying within the jurisdiction of the base BC. Then I tilt it further from this state, I get to this state, right? When I tilt it further and I get it to this state, then what happens is eventually this W becomes aligned with C. The line of action of W will pass through C, R will pass through C, right? Now, further displacement from this state. Further displacement from the state will cause W to not lie within the base BC, will cause W to not lie within the base BC, and it will get further and further displaced. That means from this point onwards, any further displacement will cause the body to lose its state of stable equilibrium. It will get into an unstable equilibrium, right? So which means, you know, it's not like you can keep tilting it and expect it to remain in stable equilibrium forever. This is the limit of stable equilibrium. Once you get to the state, beware, guard yourself, be conscious of the fact that further displacing it would cause the weight to fall outside BC. This W will cause a net clockwise turn about C, clockwise moment about C, and the body will get displaced more and more. Its stability would be lost. So there is a limit of stability. That means, you know, this was stable equilibrium. It remained stable, but only till this point. Only when the tilt was to this extent, when theta became equal to alpha, W and R were both aligned and passing through C. That's it. Further displacement will cause what? W to go outside the jurisdiction of BC, and it will tilt further and further and further. So this was a brief digression on the kinds of equilibrium. Surely there is mathematics around this, a lot more mathematics, but then I wanted you to at least understand things qualitatively. This much for this time. Catch you with more stuff after a while. Bye-bye.